I was 17 the first time my father let me hunt alone. Not alone in the way where he was parked at the end of a logging road waiting. Alone in the way where I was dropped off Friday afternoon with a pack, a sleeping bag, a Remington 700 and .308, and instructions to be at the highway by Sunday noon. He'd learned to hunt that way, his father had learned that way, and that was simply how it was done in our family. You went out. You figured it out. You came back changed in some small way that nobody talked about but everybody recognized. I came back changed that weekend, but not in the way he meant. This was late November 2019, the tail end of rifle season in Hill Country, Texas, Kimball County. A private lease our family had held for going on 2 decades. Somewhere between 1,400 and 1,600 acres of cedar breaks, limestone ridges, dry creek beds, and scrub oak. I knew that property the way you know a childhood bedroom, without looking, without thinking, by feel. Every game trail, every sendero, every place the whitetails liked to water after a cold front moved through. I had walked those hills probably 200 times by the age of 17. I had never once felt unwelcome there. That changed on the second morning. I'd set up in a ground blind near the East Ridge. A simple layout blind I'd built myself out of cedar branches and a roll of burlap mesh, positioned at the edge of a sendero where I'd been watching a mature 8-point work a scrape for the better part of 3 evenings. The plan was simple. Pre-dawn entry, sit until 9, glass the ridge during midday, get back in the blind for the last 2 hours of shooting light. I'd done it a dozen times. Knew the walk in the dark, knew where the roots crossed the trail, knew where to step to stay quiet. First morning was clean. Saw the 8-point just before 8 a.m., working the scrape exactly where I expected him. Passed on the shot. Angle wasn't right and I wanted him closer. Watched him for 40 minutes. He never knew I was there. I ate a Cliff Bar on the walk back, drank cold coffee from my Stanley thermos. Felt like the world was exactly the right size. Second morning I woke at 4:15. Got dressed in the dark. Sitka base layer, heavyweight fleece over that, and the orange vest that had belonged to my uncle before he gave up hunting. Laced my Danner boots in the cab of my truck to avoid making noise outside. Strapped on my pack, chambered around, and started walking. The path to the East Ridge follows a dry creek bed for about 300 yards. Flat, easy walking, open enough that your headlamp shows you a good 30 feet of trail ahead. Then it cuts left up a limestone switchback and opens onto the sendero. I'd made that walk so many times it was automatic. Head down, moving slow, watching where my feet went. I was about halfway along the creek bed when I heard it. Footsteps. Behind me. Distinct, deliberate footsteps on caliche and dead oak leaves. That specific crunch and settle sound that only a person in boots makes. Not a deer, not a hog, not a coyote. Person. Walking roughly the same pace I had been walking. I stopped. They stopped. The silence that came in after was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. I turned around slowly and swept my headlamp back down the trail. Nothing. Just the creek bed stretching back into the dark. The pale limestone walls on either side. The cedar scrub black and motionless at the edges of my light. No eyes. No shape. No movement. I stood there for what felt like a long time. My mouth had gone dry in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. I told myself it was a deer. I knew it wasn't a deer. I turned back around and kept walking. And I will tell you honestly that the hair on my arms didn't lie down for the rest of the morning. I got to my blind. He said. I watched the sendero go from black to gray to pale gold as the sun came up behind the ridge. The 8-point didn't show. 2 does came through around 7:30, looked straight at my blind, and left. I stayed until 9 like I'd planned, then packed up and started back. That's when I found the boot tracks. At the edge of a stock tank about a half-mile from my blind, soft clay bank, the kind that holds an impression perfectly, there was a set of boot prints. Fresh. Lug sole pattern, deep heel, looked like a size 10 or 11. Pointed toward my blind. Not alongside the main trail, but offset from it, in the brush, the way someone walks when they're trying to stay parallel to a path without being seen on it. I crouched down and looked at them for a long time. My pulse was doing something I didn't enjoy. I pulled out my phone and took a picture, and then I texted my dad. Anybody else on the lease this weekend? He came back 20 minutes later. No. Why? I told him I'd found some tracks. He said probably a neighboring ranch hand cutting through. Possible. The lease boundary wasn't fenced everywhere. I told myself that all afternoon. Ranch hand. Trespasser. Someone who'd realized they were on private land and moved on. Reasonable explanations existed, and I was 17 and didn't want to be the kid who packed out early because of footprints. Third morning I went back. For 20 a.m., same route, same creek bed. 50 yards in, the footsteps started again. Behind me, same pace, same sound, stopping the instant I stopped. This time I didn't wait. I spun around fast, headlamp on full brightness, and I caught something at the edge of my light. 60 yards back, maybe 70, just at the limit of where the beam went soft, something stepped behind a cedar tree. Not fast. That's what stayed with me. It didn't bolt, didn't startle, it stepped. Deliberately. The controlled movement of something that didn't want to be seen but wasn't panicked about nearly being seen. Like it had done this before. Like it had done this many times. I stood in that creek bed for probably 2 full minutes without moving. Nothing came back out from behind that cedar. Nothing moved. The night was absolutely still, and I was 17 years old and alone, and I had a loaded rifle in my hands, and I have never felt less safe holding it in my life. Here's the thing about fear, real fear, not the fun kind. It doesn't announce itself with a cold sweat and a racing heart the way movies show it. Comes in quiet. It reorganizes your thinking. Standing there in the dark, the thing I kept returning to wasn't "what is that?" It was it knew which path I took. 3 mornings in a row I'd walked that creek bed at the same time on the same route, and 3 mornings in a row it had been there. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern someone observed and learned. That's anticipation. I did not run. I want to be clear about that because I want to be honest about it. I walked back to my truck at a pace that was as fast as I could manage without running, and I did not look behind me once, not because I was brave but because I understood somewhere below thought that looking behind me was the thing I absolutely could not do. I sat in my truck with the doors locked and the engine running for 20 minutes. 4th morning I changed everything. Instead of the creek bed, I drove to the far end of the property and hiked in from the north. A longer approach, rougher terrain, came at the blind from above instead of below. Told no one. Just changed it. No footsteps. I sat in that blind and I kept thinking through what that meant. The thing, the person, whatever it was, had known my route because I'd repeated it. The one morning I broke the pattern, it wasn't there. You can tell me that's coincidence. You can tell me the first 2 mornings were deer and my imagination did the rest. I have heard every rational explanation and I have thought through all of them carefully, and none of them account for what stepped behind that cedar tree in a way that was too slow to be instinct and too deliberate to be accident. I packed out that afternoon. Told my dad I'd gotten what I needed out of the weekend. He gave me a long look the way he sometimes did when he suspected I wasn't saying everything. But he didn't push. I'm 22 now. I've been back to that lease several times since, always with at least one other person, always on varied routes, never the same path twice in a row. Nothing has happened. Maybe it was a trespasser who moved on. Maybe it was something that lost interest when I stopped being predictable. I genuinely don't know, and I have made a kind of peace with not knowing. But I'll tell you what I know for certain. On the 3rd morning, in that creek bed, the thing that stepped behind the cedar tree could have stayed hidden. It was far enough back that I might have seen movement but nothing more. The headlamp doesn't reach that far reliably. Could have stood still and I would have seen nothing and eventually turned around and kept walking. It stepped behind the tree after I turned. Not before, not during, after, once my light had already found the space it was standing in. It moved because it knew I could see it. And something that knows you can see it, that understands what your light means, that chooses to step out of frame rather than freeze. That's not an animal. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it wanted. I only know that for 3 mornings in a row it followed me through the dark at the same pace I walked, and it stopped the same instant I stopped, and when I finally turned around fast enough to nearly catch it, it calmly, quietly stepped out of sight. And it never came back after the morning it knew I'd seen it. Hector never lied to me. That sounds like a strange thing to say about a dog, but anyone who has spent serious time working a hunting dog knows exactly what I mean. Dogs don't perform fear. They don't exaggerate. They don't have the neurological wiring for theater. When a trained hunting dog tells you something is wrong, and the only question left is whether you're smart enough to listen. I wasn't at first. That's the part one have to live with. This was the third week of October, 2023. Grouse season in northeastern Minnesota, Lake County, mixed aspen and spruce country about 30 miles outside of Two Harbors. Public land I'd hunted for going on 8 years, a stretch of Forest Service road that cuts through second-growth timber and opens eventually into a series of low, wet hollows that hold woodcock like a magnet when the flight birds come through in mid-fall. Peak color that week. The aspens were full gold, the kind of morning where the light comes sideways through the trees and everything looks like it was painted by someone who was trying too hard. Temperature in the low 40s. No wind. Perfect. Hector was 7 years old that fall. Wire-haired pointing griffin, 68 pounds, built like a small tank with a beard. I'd started him as a pup on wild birds in Wisconsin, and by the time he was 3, he was the best dog I'd ever run. Methodical, biddable, nose that could find a woodcock in a half-acre of tag alder before I'd taken 10 steps into the cover. My dad hunted with us twice and said Hector made him feel like a bad dog owner, which was the highest compliment he knew how to give. We'd parked at the end of a 2-track around 8 a.m. and worked northwest for about 2 hours, moving through aspen edges and cutting into the spruce wherever the cover looked right. Hector flushed 2 grouse in the first hour. I connected on one, missed the second clean, and locked up a woodcock point so tight in a willow thicket that I almost stepped on the bird getting into position. Good morning. Easy morning. The kind of hunt where everything is working and you're not thinking about anything except the next covert and the angle of the light. Around 10:15 we dropped into a long, low stretch of ground. A natural drainage that runs between 2 glacial ridges, thick with tag alder and standing water and the kind of soft, black muck that sucks at your boot with every step. I'd pulled birds out of that hollow before. It looked right that morning. Water level was down from a dry September, just an inch or 2 of standing water over the muck, enough moisture to hold scent but walkable. Hector was ranging about 25 yards ahead of me, nose working the ground, tail going steady. He locked up at the edge of the hollow. Classic point, right front foot raised, tail straight back, head low and angled in. Every muscle in his body pointed at something in the alder about 15 feet inside the cover. I came up behind him the way you do, gun up, moving slow, watching the cover for the flush. He broke. 7 years. Not once, in 7 years of hunting wild birds in every kind of cover from Mississippi bottomlands to Ontario spruce bogs, had Hector broken a point before the flush. It simply was not something he did. It had been trained out of him so completely that the behavior felt hardwired, constitutional, part of what he was. And he broke. He didn't just move. He came straight back to me at a low, fast trot and pressed himself against the back of my legs with his whole body weight. Tail down, not tucked but rigid and low. Trembling. The deep, involuntary kind of trembling that has nothing to do with cold or excitement. The kind that runs through a dog's whole frame from somewhere it can't control. I'd seen it once before, when a truck had clipped his back leg on a county road 2 years prior. That kind of trembling. I reached down and put my hand on his back and felt it moving through him like a current. I looked into the hollow. 15, maybe 20 feet in, half submerged in the standing water, there was a deer carcass. Recent. Hide still on, body largely intact, lying on its side with one foreleg extended above the waterline. The head was gone. Not chewed off, not scattered, gone cleanly at the base of the skull, the kind of separation that takes force or a blade. No blood on the surrounding vegetation that I could see, which nagged at me immediately because deer don't hemorrhage politely. The water around the carcass was dark but still, not disturbed. I told myself coyotes. I told myself the head had been dragged off somewhere and the blood had washed into the muck. These things happen. I found dead deer before and the explanations are usually boring. I was not scared at this point. I was puzzled and I was curious about why my dog was acting the way he was acting, and those are different things entirely. I took one step into the hollow. Hector made a sound I had never heard him make before or since. One short, high note, not quite a whine and not quite a bark, something between the two, the kind of sound a dog makes when language fails it. And then he backed up the trail behind me, which meant I was standing at the edge of that hollow alone. That's when I noticed the smell. The carcass had an odor, obviously, the sweet rot smell of a deer that's been down 3 or 4 days in warmish water. I was expecting that. What I was not expecting was the smell underneath it. Musky and dense and animal, but wrong in a way that I keep failing to describe correctly whenever I try. The closest I've come is this: most animal smells have a kind of source. You can imagine the creature that produces them, place them in a category, connect them to something in your experience. This smell had no category. It was like standing next to something that existed just outside the edge of the sensory vocabulary I'd built up over 40 years of being in the woods. Heavy, pressurized. The smell of something large that had been in one place for a long time. I stood at the edge of the hollow for maybe 30 seconds. And then something shifted in my chest, not fear exactly, or not only fear, but a very specific, very quiet alarm that I have come to recognize over the years as the part of my brain that is older than language telling the part of my brain that uses language to stop talking and start moving. I looked at the tree line on the far side of the hollow. 40 yards, maybe 45. Mature spruce, dark trunks, zero visibility past the first row. No movement, no sound. Not even the small sounds, no chickadees, no red squirrels, no woodpeckers working the snags. The hollow was completely silent in a way that forests are not naturally silent at 10 a.m. on a clear October morning. Forests are full of ambient sound that you stop hearing because it's constant. When that sound disappears, your body knows before your mind does. Something was watching me from those trees. I did not see it. I did not hear it. I knew it the way you know when someone in a room is looking at you before you turn around. That preconscious social awareness that evolution kept because it was useful. It was not a feeling I was constructing or interpreting. It arrived fully formed like a fact. I backed out of the hollow. Slowly, deliberately, not running, picking up Hector's collar at the edge of the trail and walking back toward the two-track at the pace of someone who has made a decision. I did not look behind me. I'm not sure I could have made myself do it. There are moments in the woods when your body overrules your curiosity, and this was one of them. Hector didn't settle until we'd been driving for nearly 4 miles. Then he put his head on the center console and exhaled once, deeply, and closed his eyes. Dogs return to baseline when the threat is gone. They don't ruminate. He was done with it. I was not done with it. I went back the following morning, alone, without Hector. I left him in the truck and told myself it was because I didn't want to stress him again. Walked back into the hollow with a purpose. Told myself I was going to look at the carcass in daylight and find the rational explanation and go home satisfied. The carcass was gone. Not decomposed, gone. Moved. The water around where it had been was disturbed. Muck churned up from the bottom, and there was a drag trail through the alder going northeast, toward the far tree line. Whatever moved it had moved it from inside the hollow, through 15 feet of standing water and soft muck. I followed the drag trail to the edge of the hollow where the ground firmed up into needle duff and I lost it. That deer weighed close to 120 pounds in the water. The drag marks were single and wide, not the scattered pattern of coyotes working a carcass from multiple angles. One thing pulling hard in one direction. I've spoken to 2 other hunters about this since, serious men, both of whom have run dogs for decades. One of them listened to the whole thing and said only, "Pay attention when they won't go. They know something you don't." He said it the way people say things they believe completely but have stopped trying to explain. The other one asked me what direction the drag trail went, and when I told him northeast he nodded slowly and said that the northeast corner of that unit had a history of weirdness he didn't feel like getting into. I didn't push him. Some doors you can feel the weight of before you open them, and you leave them closed. What I keep returning to isn't the smell or the missing carcass or even the silence in the trees. It's Hector. Specifically, it's the fact that he pointed before he broke. His nose told him something was in that hollow and his body locked up the way it had 10,000 times before. Instinct and training running exactly on script. And then something overrode it. Something reached past 7 years of conditioning and 400 years of selective breeding and told a dog who had never once broken point in his working life that staying was not an option. Whatever was in that hollow, it wasn't the deer that scared him. The deer was already dead. I almost didn't believe him when he told me. Not because he seemed like someone who made things up, he didn't, not even close. 30 years as a union electrician in central Georgia will sand the embellishment right out of a man. He was the kind of person who answered, "How are you?" with a specific and accurate answer rather than a reflex, who gave directions in exact mileage rather than landmarks, who said what he meant and meant exactly what he said and nothing more. I had known him for 11 years by the time he told me this story, and in 11 years I had never once heard him exaggerate anything. That's what made it hard to sit with afterward. He told me in a Base Pro parking lot in Macon on a Tuesday afternoon in April. We'd run into each other at the fishing section, talked for a while about nothing, and then walked out to our trucks together the way you do when a conversation isn't quite finished. He leaned against his tailgate and looked at the asphalt for a moment, and then he said, "I want to tell you something that happened to me last fall, and I'm only going to say it once. So listen." I listened. He'd been hunting a wildlife management area in a county I'm not going to name. Central Georgia, big timber country, the kind of public land that gets pressure on opening weekend and then goes quiet for the rest of the season because most hunters don't want to work for it. He'd been hunting it for 6 years, had a climber stand on a white oak ridge that required a serious walk to reach, the kind of setup that filters out anyone who isn't genuinely committed. He liked it that way. He was not a social hunter. Opening week of rifle season, November 2022. He had the stand reservation, he had his license, he had everything squared away the way he always did. Planned to go in Thursday, hunt through Sunday, come out with meat or come out empty and be fine either way. He drove down Wednesday night, slept in his truck at the parking area, set his alarm for 3:45 a.m. The walk to his stand took about 45 minutes in the dark. He knew it cold, had done it enough times that his feet found the trail without the headlamp earning its keep. Across a long hardwood flat, down into a river bottom, across a slough that ran shallow in November, then up a long finger ridge to the white oaks. Simple. Familiar. He crossed the slough at 4:40 a.m. The mud on both banks was soft, that particular dark river bottom mud that takes a perfect impression and holds it for days. He'd crossed it enough times to know exactly where to step to keep his boots from sinking past the ankle. He came down the near bank, picked his line across, and looked up. There was a woman standing on the far bank. Light-colored clothing. He thought at first it was a white dress, then reconsidered and thought maybe a very light gray, something loose, something that didn't look like hunting clothes or hiking clothes or anything you'd wear in the woods at 4:40 in the morning in November. No headlamp, no flashlight, no pack, no gear, nothing in her hands. Standing completely still, maybe 35 yards from where he'd stopped, facing him directly. He said his first thought was entirely practical. Someone's in trouble. Lost hiker, confused, maybe hurt. He called out, "Hey, you okay? You need help?" She didn't answer. He called again, louder, and swept his headlamp across her. She was, and here he paused for a long moment before he said this part. She was too still. He said he'd stood in a lot of dark fields and watched a lot of deer freeze when a light hit them, and he'd seen people freeze in surprise, and this was neither of those things. This was a stillness that didn't come from surprise or caution. It was a stillness that came from somewhere else entirely, from something that simply did not operate on the same physical rhythm as a person standing in the cold. No visible breath in the air, no shift of weight, no micromovements. He stood at the edge of that slough and called out 3 times over the course of about a minute, and she did not move and did not answer, and then he turned around and walked back the way he came. He told me he wasn't scared in the way he expected fear to feel. He said it was more structural than that, more like the feeling of stepping onto a floor and feeling it give slightly underfoot, that instant recalculation of whether the thing you're standing on can hold your weight. Not panic. A very quiet, very thorough wrongness that reorganized his thinking from the ground up. He sat in his truck for 20 minutes with the engine running, and then, and this is the part that tells you everything about what kind of person he was, he drove around to the other access road on the far side of the WMA and came in from a completely different direction. He was not going to let whatever that was take his hunt from him. He got to his stand before first light and he sat through the morning and he hunted. He had a stealth cam trail camera on that white oak ridge, positioned to cover the main approach trail about 60 yards below his stand. He'd run it all season, set it on motion trigger, pulled the card every few days, mostly got deer and the occasional raccoon and once a coyote trotting through at 2 a.m. like it owned the place. Standard stuff. He pulled the card that afternoon when he came down from the stand. The last image from the previous night was a deer, time-stamped 11:47 p.m., doe moving left to right through the frame, perfectly ordinary. Before that, a raccoon at 9:20. Normal card, normal night, except for the gap. Between 2:09 a.m. and 4:33 a.m., the camera had taken 51 photographs. Motion triggered every single one of them, firing at intervals of roughly 2 minutes across a span of almost 2.5 hours. 51 images. He went through all of them on his phone screen right there in the field, scrolling slowly. Every frame was empty. Not empty like nothing had walked through. Empty like the camera was firing at something it could detect but not capture. The trail was there, the trees were there, the leaf litter was there, everything exactly as it should be, and not one image contained anything that should have triggered the sensor. 51 times across 2.5 hours, something moved in front of that camera, and 51 times the camera took a picture of nothing. He scrolled through them twice. Then he put his phone in his pocket and stood very still for a moment, and then he walked back to his truck, and he did not return to that WMA for the rest of the season. He told me all of this in a flat, even voice, the same voice he used to describe electrical panel work or driving conditions on the interstate. No drama, no performance. Just the facts in sequence, the way a man describes something he witnessed rather than something he's constructed. When he finished, I asked him if he thought the woman and the camera were connected. He was quiet for a moment. Not thinking about whether they were connected, I got the sense he'd already thought about that plenty. Quiet in the way of someone deciding how much of what they actually believe they want to say out loud. Whatever was setting off that camera, he said, came down the ridge, came down to the slough, and it was standing on the bank when I crossed. I asked him what he thought it was. He shook his head once. Not the shake of someone who doesn't have an answer, but the shake of someone who has decided the answer isn't a thing they're going to say in a Base Pro parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon. I asked him if he was going back next season. He said he'd already found a different piece of public land 2 counties over, checked the maps, looked good, plenty of white oaks on a north-facing slope. He said it like that was the complete answer, and maybe it was. He threw his coffee cup in a trash can by the cart return and unlocked his truck and then stopped with his hand on the door. You want to know the thing that actually bothers me, he said. Not a question, he was going to tell me regardless. It's not what was on the bank. It's not the camera. I waited. It's that I called out 3 times, he said. And the whole time I was standing there calling, the whole time I had my light on it, it never once looked away. Never blinked, never turned, never reacted to the light at all. Just watched me. He paused, watching like it already knew exactly what I was going to do before I did it. He got in his truck. He didn't say goodbye, just pulled the door shut and started the engine, which was how he ended most conversations. Not rudely, just efficiently, like a man who considered the business concluded. I stood in that parking lot for a while after he left. I've thought about those 51 photographs more times than I can count since then. Specifically, I've thought about the timing 2:09 a.m. to 4:33 a.m., ending about 7 minutes before he would have left his truck to start his walk-in. Whatever was on that ridge had been moving toward the slough for 2.5 hours. Patiently, slowly, consistently triggering a camera every 2 minutes in the dark. It reached the slough right around the time he did. And the thing that I keep returning to, the thing that sits at the back of everything else, he said she was facing him when he first looked up. Not turning toward him, not reacting to his headlamp. Already facing him. Already watching the near bank. Like it knew which direction he'd be coming from. Like it had been waiting. The fire should not have been burning. That is the thought I keep coming back to, even now, for years later. Not the folded sleeping bag, not the rearranged cook kit, not the spruce branches laid in that strange deliberate row at the edge of the timber. All of those things were disturbing in their own right. But the fire is the one that lives in me permanently, because a fire means someone made a decision. Someone gathered wood, someone arranged it, someone struck a flame and fed it until it caught, and then left it burning in a camp that wasn't theirs, 11 miles from the nearest road, in a wilderness unit where we were the only permitted hunters for that entire stretch of season. Someone wanted us to know they had been there. That is not an accident. That is a message. This was the last week of September 2021. Archery elk in a backcountry unit in the San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado, Unit 74, if you know the area. High country, serious country, the kind of terrain that asks something real of you before it lets you in. We'd drawn limited entry tags after 3 years of applying, me and my brother-in-law Doug. and we'd been planning the hunt for the better part of 18 months. Topo maps on the kitchen table in February. Glassing trip in August to locate the herd. Pack lists revised and re-revised until every ounce was justified. We were not casual about this. We had one shot at this unit and we intended to use it correctly. We packed in on horseback the afternoon of September 23rd. 2 riding horses, 2 mule deer on lead, 11 miles of trail that climbed from 8,400 feet to our spike camp at 10,200. Got in late, maybe 6 p.m., set up camp in the last of the light. 2 tents. A cook kit hung in a spruce about 60 yards from the tents. A fire ring we scraped together from loose rock, but didn't use because we were too tired to care about a fire. Ate cold food from our packs and went to sleep before dark. The horses were picketed in the park below camp, the mules with them. Everything was where we put it. We left at first light on the 24th and worked a basin about 2 miles northeast that the August scouting had shown us. A high cirque with a south-facing bench where the elk were feeding in the mornings before dropping into the timber. Long day. Hard country. We found sign. Heard a bull screaming his head off somewhere above us around 9 a.m. Spent 3 hours trying to close the distance and ran out of wind when it shifted at noon. The mountain beat us that day, which happens. We rode back toward camp in the late afternoon with nothing to show for it but sore legs and a better understanding of the terrain. Doug saw it first. We were coming through the last stand of spruce before the park opened up, and he pulled his horse up short and said nothing. Just stopped, which made my horse stop, and I looked past him into the camp and I saw the fire. Small fire, built in our rock ring, burning cleanly. Not a new fire, not a just lit fire. A fire that had been going for a while, settled into coals with a few sticks feeding it, the kind of fire a person builds when they know what they're doing and they're planning to sit with it for a while. Orange light in the gray of early evening. Completely, deeply wrong. Doug had his rifle out of the scabbard before I'd finished processing what I was seeing. I told him, easy, hold up, let's look. We sat on our horses at the tree line for a full 2 minutes and watched the camp. No movement. Nos chaps. The horses were uneasy, ears forward, nostrils working, but they weren't in full alarm, which I took as a partial comfort because horses will tell you when a predator is close in a way that isn't subtle. Whatever had been in that camp, they weren't smelling it anymore. We rode in slowly. My tent was zipped open about 8 inches. I'd zipped it closed that morning. I was certain of it. The habit of keeping insects out was too ingrained to forget. Just 8 inches, the zipper pull hanging at mid-height, like someone had opened it enough to look inside and then paused there. Nothing inside appeared disturbed. My sleeping bag, my dry bag, my book. Everything where I'd left it. Doug's sleeping bag was outside his tent. Folded. I want to be precise about this because it matters. Not dragged out, not pulled out in a hurry, not dumped on the ground. Folded, lengthwise first, then in thirds, the way you'd fold a sleeping bag if you were trying to be neat about it. Placed on the ground beside his tent door with the zipper pulls aligned. It takes intention to fold a sleeping bag that way. Takes time. Someone had unzipped Doug's tent, removed his sleeping bag, folded it carefully, and set it down outside. Doug looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. I didn't say anything either. The cook kit had been taken down from the tree. The bear hang we'd rigged the night before, a good hang, 9 feet up and 6 feet out from the trunk, and placed on the ground near the fire ring, pack lid open. We went through it carefully. Nothing missing. Nothing taken. Nothing added. Nothing visibly tampered with. Just moved. Set down with the same deliberateness as the sleeping bag, the same quality of intention behind every action. We called out, "Hello. Is anyone there? Hello." 3 times into the timber on each side of the park. The mountains gave us back silence, and then wind, and then silence again. We cleared the tree line on horseback, rode the full perimeter of the park, pushed into the spruce on both sides, covered maybe 400 yards of timber in the remaining light. Nothing. No tent, no gear, no tracks that we could identify with certainty on the needle duff. No fire ring other than ours. No food smell, no human smell, nothing the horses reacted to. We sat up all night, built our own fire up high and kept it burning, took shifts, kept the rifles where we could reach them. The night was clear and cold and absolutely still. Nothing came into camp. Nothing called from the timber. The horses stayed calm after midnight. which was the only thing that made the darkness manageable. Morning came pale and unhurried like it always does at altitude, and in the early light I walked the park perimeter on foot and found the branches. At the northeast corner, where the grass met the spruce, someone had laid a row of freshly cut spruce boughs on the ground. 8 of them, maybe 10, I didn't count carefully the first time, and I wish I had. Same length, roughly 18 inches each. Same thickness, roughly thumb width. Laid parallel to each other with maybe 2 inches of spacing, like a small ladder or a deliberate pattern, positioned precisely at the boundary between the open park and the dark timber. Fresh cut, the sap at the cut ends was still white and wet. I crouched over them for a long time. I took photographs. I looked at the spacing, the uniformity, the care that had gone into making them identical. This was not random. This was not debris. Someone had cut these branches to a consistent size and laid them with the precision of someone who had done this before, who knew what they were doing, who intended the arrangement to be found. I have no explanation for what it meant. I've looked at photographs of trail markers from a dozen different cultures and wilderness traditions and found nothing that matched. I've asked trackers and Forest Service rangers and backcountry guides, and the closest response I ever got was from an old outfitter out of Durango who looked at the photos for a long time and said, "That's a boundary marker. Whatever made it was telling you where it starts." We packed out that morning, left 3 days of a 5-day hunt on the mountain, loaded the horses at first light, and didn't speak much on the 11 miles back to the trailhead. I filed a report with the Forest Service office in Durango 2 days later, described the fire, the sleeping bag, the cook kit, the branches, all of it. The ranger I spoke to asked careful questions and told me there were no other permitted parties in the unit and no reports of unauthorized access. He was thorough and professional. But before we hung up, he asked me something I wasn't expecting. He said, "Can I ask, when you rode in and saw the camp before you processed any of it, were you afraid?" I thought about it for a moment and said yes. He said, "That's a reasonable response." I asked him what he meant by that reasonable response to what specifically. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the Forest Service appreciated me filing the report, and he wished me safe travels, and the line went quiet. He never answered the question. I've thought about that a lot, the specific shape of what he didn't say. A man in that job, in that country, who hears a story like mine and responds not with skepticism or reassurance, but with "that's a reasonable response." That's a man who has heard something similar before. That's a man who has a category for it. Whatever was in that camp had 11 miles of wilderness between it and the rest of the world. It had time and patience, and the knowledge of exactly where we were and exactly when we'd be gone. It built a fire in our ring and folded a sleeping bag and cut branches to identical lengths and laid them in a row, and then it walked back into the timber and waited. And the thing I can't get away from, the thing that makes the most ordinary moments feel suddenly thin, we never heard it leave. 11 miles of mountain, 2 experienced hunters, for animals with better senses than either of us. Not a sound. That's all 4 stories, and if any of them are staying with you tonight, sitting quiet in the back of your mind the way these things do, then you already know why this channel exists. Black Fears is where these stories live. If this is your first time here, subscribe and stay close. There's a lot more darkness where that came from. We'll see you in the next one, if you make it through.